This is a much abbreviated talk from one that I delivered at the Revis Festival in March. I had done what I call a little tag team operation with one of my favorite researchers, Albert Turnbull, who many of you may know. And Albert wasn't able to come, so I had to read his part of the talk and then continue on with mine. And he gave basically a history of the first 400 years of Turnbulls, all the way through the Barons of Minto, down to about 1715, which is where Wally's family comes in. And I picked it up and gave kind of the next 300 years based upon my wacky Turnbull family. So please bear with me, I'm talking personal stories. That usually bores people to death, and I may go on too long, so if it gets, somebody tell me to wind it up if you've had enough. But I start out by telling you that growing up, I understood three things about my Turnbull family. Number one, we descended from the Reverend James Turnbull, who was born in Stitchell near Kelso in 1798. Number two, we were not related to any Turnbulls that we ever met, especially those in America, because we were the first generation of our family to move to America. And that's when I would throw up my snappy little slide showing you the ship's it was a TWA manifest from 1956 when we flew to America, and next to me on the manifest was none other than Ravi Shankar, about to embark on a worldwide tour. My claim to fame. I didn't know him, I was 2 years old. And third was that I was the first girl born in our Turnbull line in over 200 years. That was quite a reputation to live up to, right? Now, my basic family tree supported all of these suppositions. After all, I have 5 brothers. I have 2 sisters, but they're much younger, so they don't count. They kind of break the pattern. My father, Douglas, only had 1 brother, Malcolm, and he emigrated to Australia. Their father, Kenneth, only had 4 brothers, Edward, Robert, Walter, and Alexander. Aren't these all great Turnbull names? And a transcription in the front of our restored family Bible clearly shows a line of men from Robert, born in 1760, to James, born in 1798, through to my grandfather, Kenneth, born in 1892. The entry preceding Robert was for his sister Jean, who was born in 1754, exactly 200 years prior to me. Obviously, this is the source of the family legend, but was it true? The Bible had belonged to a Mary Mean, the wife of William Turnbull, and the date 1760 appears after her name, which coincidentally is the year that Robert was born, father of the Reverend James. There are some original pages left in this Bible that have been burned in a fire, and it shows the children of William Turnbull, but the fire damage had rendered some of the dates unreadable. His first son was a William, born in 1742. Listen to these names and dates, because if you're looking for somebody, they may be in my Bible. John was born in 1748, James born in 1749 or 50, Francis born in 1751, and Jean born in 1754. Robert is not listed here in the original part of the Bible, although there could have been an additional page that was burned in the fire. We don't really know. But my speculation is that Mary Mean died giving birth to him, and that's why she was unable to write his name in the Bible, because the inscription in the back says Mary Mean, her Bible, which sounds like somebody trying to remember her rather than her writing her own name in it. Thanks to Scotland's people, if you don't know how to use it, let me know, I'll give you lessons. I was easily able to find birth entries for Francis and Jean, the 2 girls, but not the boys. William Turnbull and Mary Mean are listed as their parents. Francis was born in Eccles and Jean in Kelso. And I knew that Robert was also born in Kelso, but struggled to find a record for him. A new variant spelling of Turnble, it's the first time I'd run across that one, kept his birth record hidden for decades. In 1968, a genealogist had been hired to find the parents of Robert, and the conclusion was that the closest possibility was a William Turnbull and Agnes Walker of Sprouston, a mistake that still appears in online genealogies to this day. To date, I've never found a marriage record for William and Mary, and I suspect I never will, because If you've done any kind of digging in this part of the country, you will find they were members of a dissenting church, they belonged to the Relief Church, and indeed there are not many records for many of those churches because it was the nature of their dissent. We had this discussion at lunchtime about Turnbulls not being able to be corralled easily. And there were too many Mary means for me to choose from, and I was kind of stuck at this point. But recently, through the wonders of DNA, I was matched to my Mary mean to the Mean family of Melrose, where we were at today. I didn't throw my local family story in here. But it turns out that Mary Mean comes from the Mean family of Melrose, who were the famous builders of the Abbey. They were Masons that go back all the way to the beginning, and in fact founded the first Freemason society that is based in Melrose, one of the oldest in the world.
Wow.
And we do know that there were Turnbulls in that town, and I can only guess that maybe my William Turnbull came from Melrose, but I don't know for sure. We know from Francis's marriage record in 1779 that he was dead by then and that he had been a gardener in Eccles, but beyond that, I don't have a clue. Once again, enter DNA, because the closest DNA match to my father happens to be Wally sitting over there. And we know that Wally descends from the Turnbulls of Deanside, who left in 1715. You can read all about that in Rulewater and His People.
What year again?
1715.
Thank you.
And what I suspect is that he may well have been a nephew. That would be about the closest relationship that we can look at. But I don't think that those Turnbulls ever left Scotland. I think that they were always on the other side of the river, as I like to say, hanging around in Melrose, Kelso, and that area. So if you descend from any of those Turnbulls or Melrose appears in your background at all, let me know. I'm going to grab some DNA from you and see if we match. I know from the old parish records that Robert, son of William, had 4 sons born in Stichel, and assumed from the Bible entry that only James, my great-great-grandfather, survived. Not much is known about his early life, but Robert was an elder in the Kelso Relief Church. And there are some records that I need to sit down and read. I haven't read them all, but you can go over to the Borders Family History Association, or you can look in the research center in Hoyt, and you can sit and read these old parish records and see if they happen to mention your ancestors. It takes a long time, I can assure you. Not much is known about his early life, but he was certainly an agricultural laborer, because by 1818 he moved the family to Glasgow, and it's there that the Reverend James, or he was just James at that point, enters Glasgow University, home of the Turnbulls, to study for the ministry. And he stayed there until 1826, and in 1827 the Reverend James received his first commission to be a minister of the Relief Church in Edinburgh, at Brighton Street. In 2009, here it says, I was surprised, apparently, to learn that a bound volume of letters existed at my parents' house. And these are my parents when they were living in Georgia in America. These were sent to the Reverend James between 1827, when he moved to Edinburgh, and 1839, when he published his first book. They present an intimate view of family and church life, and as we shall see, they debunk some family myths. The very first letter is written by Robert, the father, and provided a great surprise, because it begins, "My dear son and daughter." Wait a second, I thought I was the first girl born in the family in 200 years. What's this daughter? And it turns out that James had a sister, Elizabeth, who went with him to Edinburgh to be his housekeeper as he was setting up as the bright young minister in the town. And not only that, she is not in the family Bible, and I can find no birth record for her anywhere in the Borders that matches the time. So she's a bit of an enigma to me. Either she wasn't born up here, which is always possible, or they decided not to register her birth, which is another hazard that you get into in doing genealogy. Also in that first letter, they mention a child, Alex, who happens to be her son, and it turns out that Alex was raised by his parents in Glasgow, and he ends up writing many of the letters included in this collection. Typically, these letters follow a pattern. They talk about the health of the family. If you're interested at all in social life in early 19th century Scotland, it's absolutely fascinating. The gossip, the accounts of breach of promise cases, what's going on in the local church, absolutely fascinating. And I've started transcribing them and putting them online, and at some point we'll track down all of the people that are mentioned, and their children will be immensely happy that they can find their parents in these silly little letters. I don't really have time to read from any of them. I'll try a couple of excerpts without boring you too much. But basically, between 1830 and 1834, we learn first of the marriage of the Reverend James to a Margaret Weddell. She was the wealthy daughter of a wealthy confectioner and a high constable in Edinburgh. Incredible family. It kept us sustained for a couple of generations. And then the subsequent births of their first three children, Janet, Robert, and Agnes. So much for the scarcity of women in my family. The spring of 1832 brings news from Smelham. I don't know if any of you have driven out there. I know that, Bill, you went out to Smelham Tower. But that is the village where Robert's wife, Agnes Fairbairn, came from. And he says, I had a letter from James Stevenson informing us that his brother William was to be married to Betty Pringle last week, and he and his wife and Margaret Pringle and her husband were to sail from Annan on the 12th of this month for New Lanark, North America. So we have got a letter sent to John by them. James tells me that there is about 30 going from Smelham this season to America, which is a great number from such a small place. Smelham was not a very big village even back then, and to have 30 people emigrate in 1 year to North America pretty much, I think, devastated the town. In fact, if you go to the church there now, you'll see that some of the Canadian descendants of those families have put markers in the village telling how they're all related. There's church gossip. He talks about James Fairbairn, who would have been Agnes's brother. He was farming at a farm called Gurnick, which exists to this day. And then he talks a little bit about Mellerstane Mill. The Fairbairns' siblings' father was the miller at Mellerstane, and Mellerstane is a big country estate now, not too far from here, which you can all go and visit. And I warn you, at one time, their housekeeper was an Agnes Turnbull. I don't know who she is or where she fits into the story, but she would be fascinating to follow about. One of the reasons I bring this up is that it mentions specifically that they were emigrating from Annan. And I've seen many times in records people think that their Turnbulls came from Annan, and it may be that, like William Stevenson, they were simply sailing from that port, that wasn't where they lived at all. That it would have been the closest port from the borders if you were going to North America. Many people also went up through Glasgow, and there were other routes that people took, but apparently Annan in the 1830s was a very popular port to sail from. September 1832 also brings news from Canada. There's a letter from John, who was happy to see William Stevenson, so we know that Will made it there safely, and to get news from back home. And that's when I realized that John must be none other than my James's eldest brother, who I just assumed had died as a child. He's not mentioned really in the Bible, but he must have moved, and he moved early. And that kind of, inspired me to think that, I've got all of these new relatives now filling up my family tree, coming from the borders, and all of a sudden over in North America. 1832 also brings a sad story, the sad death of the Reverend James's first daughter, Janet, who died as an infant, and she's buried in Canongate Kirkyard in Edinburgh. Many children died. It was also the beginning of the cholera years, and the letters are full of the stories of cholera throughout Glasgow. Robert often fills the pages with what I call religious fervor, and he's got stories about what's going on in the local church. They were living in an area of Glasgow called Bridgeton, and if you ever go to Bridgeton now, you can see the remains of the cemetery that was where the Relief Church was, that they all worshipped at. And I assume that that's where my Turnbulls are buried, but there are no records to support it, and most of the gravestones are gone. But On the 5th of March, 1837, Alex writes from Glasgow, "Dear